But one of these is the potential that the nitrogen that's been applied to the land surface, that a certain fraction of that has actually gone on and stimulated the growth not simply of crop plants that are seasonal. They grow up during the year of planting and then die away and decompose or get burned, but plants that actually have a long life nature to them in nature. And of course, forests are primary among those. How much of the nitrogen fertilizer that's applied to the land surface, some of it's applied directly to forests, but other portions of that nitrogen essentially escapes from agricultural fields, either in the form of various gases like ammonia or other forms, particulates, and is deposited in forests and can stimulate their growth. There's some interesting paper, Magnani, that came out a couple of years ago in Nature that showed for a suite of forests across Europe that the amount of nitrogen being deposited from the atmosphere, as measured in often nothing more sophisticated than a bottle and funnel, the amount of nitrogen deposited seemed to be related to the growth of the forest receiving it. This was net ecosystem production, carbon uptake in forests as a function of their nitrogen deposition. I've had a lot of graduate students over the years. I don't think I've ever had one of them come back with an R squared of 0.97. So if nothing else, one might want to praise the strength of that correlation. I think there's a lot of evidence that perhaps the slope of that line is unrealistically steep, and the implication for the amount of nitrogen being taken up by forests worldwide by that process might be overdone. But nevertheless, it's a provocative result that came out a couple of years ago and certainly motivated me to do a little bit more with it. Now, what I have done, and actually this is the kind of thing that is very convenient to do in a job like I have now, where you're doing administration most of the time and you may be getting ready to have a great thought, and somebody comes down the hall and says the Xerox machine isn't working. So you have to be able to do things in bite-sized portions. And one of the best things is that I've found over the years is these kinds of literature compilations. This is a small part of a rather large table that I'll be glad to share with any of you, that for various forestry experiments in different species, in stands of trees of different age, getting nitrogen fertilizer at different amounts. Basically, the investigator had spent some time figuring out where that nitrogen went, how much of it ended up in the trees, so that's the amount of the plant, how much of it in litter, how much in the soil organic matter, how much leached away. This is the total recovery. You'll see the total recoveries in many cases disappointingly low, which of course leaves a lot of nitrogen unexplained as to where it went. But what I was particularly interested in is how much ended up in the plants. And arguably, you can look at plants or plants plus soil and see something on the order of 30 to 50% of it applied in a fertilization experiment in a forest would end up in the vegetation. And so, from a global point of view, one can say, gee, how much of this nitrogen that's applied to the land surface might get away from the point of application and be expected to rain out or be deposited in forest, and then take for 30 and 50% of it as kind of the extremes, and say that might be accumulated in forest biomass. And if you do that, something on the order of 9 teragrams is the implication of storage as a result of stimulated growth of the land plant component of the, or the land component of the nitrogen cycle. So, measurable, estimatable, certainly. A big fraction of the nitrogen coming onto the land surface, probably not. That's probably a little disappointing to policymakers currently concerned with climate that are hoping that one way or another humans might stimulate the growth of forests worldwide and have them soak up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Certainly a little bit of that is going on, but is it something we can count on to solve climate change? Probably not. The same way we can't count on it to soak up a huge fraction of the nitrogen applied on the land surface. So we can look at the second pathway. If it's not staying on the land, how much is coming off at rivers? Ecologists and limnologists and students of aquatic ecosystems have known for years that rivers, of course, they're an unrelenting flow of materials from the land surface to the ocean. And it would make sense that a certain fraction of that is nitrogen that's coming out of terrestrial soils, both fertilized and natural. And so our question today is to figure out, gee, how much could that number have increased from 27 teragrams pre-industrially to some larger number now, because we're adding all this nitrogen to the land surface in agricultural production. Now, this is a case where I found some really useful literature that was out there. Nico von Bremen has spent his career, he's an interesting guy because he has a great career in nitrogen cycling, but right about after he published his paper in 2002, he quit his university job and is now running an art gallery in Amsterdam. So midlife crises come in all forms. But his accumulated literature on nitrogen in rivers is really wonderful. And this is one of my favorites, in which for watersheds of major world rivers, so the Amazon and the Mississippi are on here, and the Connecticut and the Hudson are probably in this mid-range. Those kinds of rivers. He had measured total inputs to the watershed, and then the nitrogen exported in the river water. The correlation is not quite as good as we saw earlier for forests, but 0.63, 63% of the variation is no slouch. Decent slope on this. 23% of the nitrogen applied on the land surface is seen to escape off in rivers across a wide variety of watersheds. And so again, rather cavalierly, I guess I said, well, gee, if this is the amount of nitrogen being applied to the land surface, and we assume that Nico's regression applies to watersheds of the land worldwide, that about 23% of that could come into the ocean. And there's some other people that have tried some similar approaches and gotten numbers that kind of range between 20 and 27. And our original river flow of 27 teragrams to the ocean might have potentially doubled. In other words, 23% of the input becomes a doubling of the amount that would flow from land to sea in rivers. A huge human perturbation, a rough doubling of the transport of nitrogen in rivers of the world. Easy to understand why that's showing up in various kinds of perturbations of estuaries. Scott, I don't know how that compares to the estuaries we worked on up here in New England. I don't think it's out of the realm of that, but all across along the East Coast, various estuaries that have seen that kind of nitrogen-derived perturbation that we need to be concerned with. And on a global basis, potentially a doubling of the amount of river flow. You'll see an arrow coming down in here into groundwater. And when I began to do this, I found very quickly that we knew nothing about groundwater. If you went out to the literature, I couldn't find a single study where somebody had estimated the amount of nitrogen going into groundwater globally, even though in Iowa and Illinois and other places of intensive nitrogen fertilizer use, the nitrate content of groundwater has now increased so that it's unfit for human consumption. And so we know that nitrogen is getting away from us in a downward and vertical sense, but no good estimate of that globally. It's an estimate of how much groundwater is produced, but not what the nitrate content of it might be. I did, however, find in the U.S. Geological Survey a survey of some 1,800 wells across the U.S. For their nitrate-nitrogen concentration. And you can see in these darker colors here in the Midwest and upper Midwest, West Texas, where a lot of cotton is growing, out here in the Central Valley of California, the Washington wheat belt up there in the state of Washington, where a lot of nitrogen fertilizers used, the wells have a lot of nitrate content in them. In other parts of the country, the nitrogen content of well water is often unmeasurable. And so I'm going to take the assumption, which we could argue at any amount of length, but I don't think either side of the argument will have any literature to support what we might be arguing, that the nitrate concentration of well water pre-industrially was unmeasurable or close to zero, and that all the nitrogen today is probably the human perturbation of the last 150 years.